All right, we'll get started. Hi, good morning, and thank you for joining us in our quarterly peer-to-peer collaborative meeting for our OVC Addressing the Criminalization of Minor Victims of Sex Trafficking project. My name is Fabiola Rincon. I am a site manager with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and I'm helping support today's presentation. Today we have Rebecca Epstein, the director of the Georgetown Center on Gender Justice and Opportunity, as well as Thalia Gonzalez, who is a senior scholar at the center. Together with Jamilia J. Blake, they co-authored the report, Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood. I'll put that link to the report in the chat. If you have any questions for our presenters, please feel free to type them into the chat box and we'll respond to them as time allows. You may also use the raise your hand icon and be called upon. We're excited to have this dual speak to us about the adultification bias and how it factors into working with victims of child trafficking. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll pass it along to our presenters.
Thanks so much. Thalia and I are excited to be here today to talk about adultification bias in the juvenile justice system, how it might be affecting some of the outcomes for Black girls today. We've been doing this work since our first report that Fabiola just mentioned in 2017, when we produced a report that showed our quantitative findings in 2017. And we followed that up in 2019 with a qualitative study that reflected the findings from focus groups that we conducted across the country with Black women and girls. So we're going to start today by asking you whether you have heard the term adultification bias before. And Fabiola, if you could run that poll, we'd like to hear what folks have to say. Can everyone see the poll?
Yeah, going, we have people answering. We're about 68% of participants answering.
Fantastic. Sorry, I couldn't see that. To me, it looked like 0.
No, I'm watching it. You said it. All right, we got 68% yes, 32% no if you are not able to see that.
Great. All right. Well, hopefully we will right that balance a little bit today during this presentation. So here are the learning objectives that we hope to come to by the end of our hour together today. We're first going to start off by talking you through some facts, some statistics, some data about girls in the juvenile justice system, because there's so many myths that we need to fight through before we can really see the challenges and the problems that we need to tackle. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the paths into the juvenile justice system, particular to Black girls, that affect them more so than white girls. And we'll talk about implicit bias, gender bias, racial bias, and then intersectional bias, where the two come together along with bias against a person's age, the intersection of which Black girls sit. And then we're going to do a deep dive into adultification bias, what our studies have shown, and talk about its implications for Black girls in the juvenile justice system. And then we're going to engage you in conversation about ways that you can correct the bias against Black girls. So our next interactive exercise comes up right away before we dive in, and it's going to be a word cloud exercise. Hopefully you all have your phones with you and can use a QR code. We're going to ask you to answer the question, what words come to mind when you think of girls in the juvenile justice system? And there's the QR code. If you can scan that with your iPhone cameras and just put in the words that come to mind, we're going to hopefully create a word cloud anonymously. Resilient. That's a powerful pairing between resilient and all of these negative terms: unloved, unequal, trauma, lost, trapped. Going to give you a few more seconds. These are really, really powerful terms that you're putting in to this poll. So I appreciate everyone's participation. And look, systemic failure down there really pointing to the institution as opposed to the girls themselves, which we all appreciate. The injustice system instead of the justice system. Yeah. And it looks like misunderstood is the most commonly entered term. Another resilience. Well, thank you. That's really wonderful. I'm gonna capture that before I turn to the next slide. So we're here to talk about what it sounds like a lot of you are already familiar with in terms of the myths that surround girls in the juvenile justice system, especially girls of color, and even within girls of color, especially Black girls. And even though statistics actually show that there are much harsher penalties for Black girls in the system, they're still rarely the focus of legal analysis and, even more importantly, law and policy solutions. A lot of people are under the misimpression that girls really aren't in the justice system at all, or the legal system as it might be more appropriately termed, given that injustice system that someone entered into the word cloud on the last slide. There's also the misconception about girls being treated leniently, that boys are the only ones who are rooted into the system through pipelines, through the dominant school to prison pipeline, for example. That dominant narrative really only focuses on boys. And then there are many who believe that the legal system isn't influenced by implicit bias at all. So we're here to deconstruct those myths, and I'm going to turn it over to Thalia for some of the facts that can blow through some of these myths.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. So again, as I looked at the word cloud and I started to even map out on my own some of those words, when we think about forgotten, we think about overlooked, we think about systemic failure, when we're putting racism in there, I think I certainly would have added patriarchy, right? And thinking about sexism, the ways in which also queer identities are showing up and how and where that is leading to an even deeper space and place in which that forgotten joy is also being overlooked and girls are deeply being misunderstood. And so in turning now to the next slide, part of this is to help create some context, right? So if our system is failing, it's not an if, it's an is. And it's really important that we can look at some of these disaggregated facts to really build up that context so that perhaps when you're working in different stakeholder settings, this becomes useful information as you're connecting across the work that you're doing and then thinking about, well, what are those root causes? So if it's that girls are overlooked, if it's that there is systemic racism, if there is systemic sexism, if there is that intersectional component, as we will get to later in the presentation, then how and where do we look at the data to be evidencing of that? And one of those places is to think about arrest rates for girls. So again, to Rebecca's point, there's often the counterpoise that suggests in a more public discourse or in unaggregated data that it's really about boys. And while boys are central, unfortunately, within the context of the juvenile system and the criminal legal system, we cannot overlook the ways in which girls are deeply present. And in fact, we were having conversations yesterday with a judge on the rise. So the ways in which they're representationally showing up is increasing on a regular basis. So here, thinking about not just the increasing proportion, but then what that relative proportionality is in terms of girls of color, using that term more broadly, and thinking about the aggregated data in that way. So arrest rates, one of those places where we can think about those root causes that each of you are focusing on and brought to the forefront, but that ultimately really evidence that. Next slide. But it's not just thinking about arrest rates more generally, right? But it's arrest rates for status offenses. So as we all know, right, the offenses that only you as a young person, right, only you as a minor can be arrested for. And we see in particular the highest levels of prevalence for Black and Latina girls. And in fact, 75% for girls who are 15 and younger. So when we're talking about marginalization, when we're thinking about the ways in which we're, as a system, right, making a set of determinations, right, that age becomes really important as we start to bracket that around adultification bias as its own unique phenomenon. Next slide. We can think about this in terms of technical violations, right? So girls are being charged for technical violations for less serious offenses. And again, I saw in the word cloud, right, victims, that word in particular, even when they're victims of crimes. And so you see a study, not our study, but an independent study that was done that was looking, right, in terms of then girls who are failing probation, right, that these aren't new crimes, these are technical violations, right, and that this presumption is about boys. Next slide. Also, getting to that point about technical violations, it's the, well, why, right? Because when we're examining bias, you have to look at root cause, you have to think about the why. So there's always all of the data, right? There's always the externality that you can point to, but until you deal with the why, the underlining, the systemic failure, right? The forgottenness, the marginalization, the being overlooked, the being misunderstood, especially in the presence of trauma, that's where we get to talking about adultification bias and bias even more broadly. So, what are the justifications? Failure to attend, right? Failing drug tests, housing instability, and then in particular, right, around victimization. And so running away is actually one of the primary reasons for technical violations for 89% of girls of color. Next slide. Now, it's not just thinking upstream, right? So earlier stages in terms of both arrests and then in terms of the pre-charge, but also for confinement. So we often see that girls are being confined for less serious offenses than boys. And that can be, we've heard justifications, that's what we have to take care of girls, right? Sort of being stuck in this middle place of patriarchy in particular and sexism being at play. But then how that then is intersecting with, are we serving those needs, right? What are the best ways of addressing the totality of needs that girls and girls of color have so that their resilience and their forgotten joy can be what we are supporting, not what we are ultimately quashing. And so again, right, studies are affirming that this is for technical violations, mental health issues, familial blues, housing instability. So it's not that girls are not part of the system, it's that they're part of the system, but they are being erased or overlooked, but that's just not factually true. Next slide. And then it's really about longer terms of confinement, which flies in the face of all of the scientific evidence coming out of the pediatric community that really focuses on duration of confinement and when we don't see a return on investment, right? Meaning more harm is being created from confinement. Moving through the criminal legal system in and of itself is health harming, but as we increase duration and time of confinement, it's even more health harming, right? So the long-term effects of what confinement look like really land upon bodies in very significant ways for juveniles during that time of adolescence in particular, but even in the earlier years and especially for our younger girls. And that matters because girls are actually confined for longer than boys for those low-level charges, and Black girls disproportionately within that category of girls and girls of color are sentenced longer. So again, we have to ask ourselves, well, why? What is the driver for that, right? Why do we see this level of disproportionality? And unfortunately, we'll move to the next slide to start thinking about some of the answers for that. So at the end of the day, this comes down to a set of discretionary decisions, right? All of the ways in which our young people come in contact with our justice system, our juvenile criminal legal system, child welfare, all of the ways in which we, in theory, right, should be wrapping our arms around young people, not from a punitive standpoint, but from a rehabilitative standpoint, is about discretionary decisions and individualized decisions. And as Judge Redwine is emphasizing here, well, we come into that decision-making process with a set of biases. And judges in particular, in this quote, right, that reflection is, how do we safeguard against that because they are so prevalent? It's not to point a finger at one person or another people and say, oh, well, it's just your bias or it's this particular manifestation, but it lives within all of us. And so how do we think about that internal and external, getting to systemic failure of bias interruption? Next slide, please. So when we dive deeper into thinking about implicit bias, this is what we're hoping you will be sitting with. Now, you've probably sat through other implicit bias trainings, so I'm not going to take the moment to read this to you, but I just want to emphasize that it's stereotypes, it's beliefs, it's attitudes, and it's those gut feelings, right? So, and it's also then the environment that's created when all of those things come together in very informal ways, right? So a conversation, again, we were having yesterday with a judge was what's the hallway conversation in describing girls, right? How are they being referred to by a whole host of system actors along the trajectory, but in those little interlocking conversations? And that's where implicit bias really comes out and is deeply pernicious. Next slide, please. So often, right, we hear, well, then, but bias is only against certain groups, or maybe bias is acting in favor, right? This sort of false terminology about reverse racism. Biases are going to work in all kinds of ways, right? And being from a particular community does not isolate you or insulate you from your bias. That is across all kinds of identity lines. And so just sort of keeping that in mind too, that we all have this work to do. We're all coming into this in these deep and different ways. Next slide. But it's not just about implicit bias generally, right? And I think this is where we want to start to dive a little deeper and start to do, right, the piece puzzling together to see the bigger picture. So there's gender bias, right? So how we think about the ways in which, and we're using judges as the example here, that stereotypes about gender, right, and about sex are coming through in the decision making. And that's deeply influential. And so the ways in which a Black girl, a Latina, right, is showing up in these spaces, the presumptions, the stereotypes about the gender or gender nonconformance are then going to come into play as one layer. Next slide. But it's not just about gender, right? It's also about race. So how we think about race and the fact that that too is influencing decision-making across a whole host of stakeholders. Again, we're using judges here as a centrality because they are so significant in the legal process as a decision maker, but as you know, right, and you're working in the different spaces that you are, there's a whole host of others that hold that discretionary power. So again, right, looking at the data, 12% longer when we think about just disaggregating based on race. So if we have an operation, right, of implicit bias at a gender level, if we have an operation of implicit bias in terms of race, then what else should we be thinking about for our young girls, our girls of color, our Black girls in particular? Next slide. And that's the point of intersectional bias, because there's also age bias, right? And so when we think about all of these things, not just coexisting, but co-interacting, right? This is Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectional bias. We stand at the crossroads, right, of an intersection or cars, and multiple cars ultimately hit someone all at the same time, right? That experience of that compounding nature becomes so critical. And so next slide. This then puts us at that visual intersection, that Black girls in particular are uniquely vulnerable to gender bias, to racial bias, and to age bias. And it's important to think about why and where this has been left out of bigger conversations, because in your implicit bias trainings, you may have done the Harvard implicit bias test, or test, shall I say. But if you go back and look at that page, what you'll see is that there is nothing that maps all of these three together. You can take a test for your gender bias. You can take a test for your racial bias. You can even take a test for age bias, but you will not see something that brings them all together, which matters so deeply when we think about what adultification bias is and how it manifests. I'll turn it over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Thalia. So we've arrived at that point of doing our deep dive into adultification bias, which is a form of intersectional bias that affects Black girls. And I want to just start with oh no, we have changed the order of slides, Thalia, and I forgot. So when we're thinking about implicit bias, we're thinking most centrally about stereotyping and how Black women in particular have historically, since certainly the beginnings of our country's foundings and before, been subjected to stereotypes that are unique to them at the intersection of their gender and their race. And they're so common that they are known by nicknames, which says a lot about the common harm of these stereotypes being projected onto Black women. There's the hypersexualized Black women, which is often referred to as the Jezebel, and the Sapphire, which represents the angry Black woman. And these stereotypes, especially when they're projected onto girls, increase the likelihood that Black girls will be perceived as disrespectful, as hypersexualized, as aggressive and threatening, even when they're engaging in the same conduct as their white peers, because we are layering on our interpretation of Black girls' behavior the lens of these stereotypes. So here's our definition of adultification bias, which is a unique form of intersectional bias against Black girls. And it's the perception of Black girls as older and more like adults and less innocent, critically, than their white peers. So along the same lines of what Thalia was just going over, adultification bias reflects automatic assumptions about Black girls. No need for context. This is just the lens through which adults are perceiving Black girls. It's not caused by their behavior or their life experiences. It's all in the mind of the adult who is perceiving them. So we distributed a survey that was designed by Dr. Jamilia Blake at Texas A&M University. And we asked adults across the country about their perceptions of the innocence of both Black girls and white girls. And it asked very overt questions like the ones that you see here. Do Black girls need to be supported? Do Black girls need to be nurtured, comforted? On the flip side, do Black girls know more about sex? And we asked the same questions about white girls so that we could compare answers. And we divided the questions into age brackets, 4 age brackets. It's 0 to 4 years old, 5 to 9 years old, 10 to 14, and then 15 to 19. And critically, we did not give any contextual clues as factors for consideration. We just gave these very sort of bald questions. And our hypothesis was that the greatest discrepancy in adults' perceptions of girls' innocence between Black girls and white girls would come in high school during puberty and adolescence. But that wasn't what the results reflected, which really surprised us. And this is the chart that shows our findings. Little bit hard to intuit, so I'll just walk you through it briefly. That clear line at the bottom represents participants' answers about white girls, and they're held at a constant so that you can see the difference between their answers for white girls and Black girls. And as you can see, the age group in which adults were most discrepant in how they viewed Black girls' innocence compared to white girls was in the age group of 10 to 14 years old. And the second biggest difference in perceptions of innocence was in the age group of 5 to 9 years old. And high school, teenage years came in last, but the discrepancy is still there. So what this shows is that adults are viewing Black girls as less innocent than white girls all the way across childhood, including during an age when girls are really looking around the world to shape their views of what the world expects of them and where they fit in and where they don't. So of course, the idea that any one race is less innocent or more adult-like than another is not supported by science. We've sprinkled in just a few surveys here to show the evidence that disproves the idea that one race could be more mature or developmentally advanced than another. And the Supreme Court has recognized the validity of this science, and they've established, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with, that children should be treated with leniency and compassion different than we treat adults, in part because of their unique developmental attributes, that children are capable of change, that their brain development is still in progress, that they're not mature, that they don't assess risk in the same way that adults do. And because of that, we've set up the juvenile justice system, whose purpose is supposed to be, as all of you know, to rehabilitate as opposed to punish. So in its holdings about children, the Supreme Court has cited to neuroscience research to buttress this idea, including their precedent that courts can't impose the death penalty or mandatory juvenile life without parole when they are facing children's cases. And Justice Kagan, this is a quote from her showing that the court's holdings are based on the recognition that children are less culpable as a matter of their developmental stage. And her reasoning and the court's reasoning throughout the last 25 years should not change based on the child's race, gender, or life experience. So I want to turn to the first study on adultification bias, which was done in 2014, as we turn to think about the implications of this difference in perception of innocence. But before I do, I'd love you to use the chat to think about adultification bias and what you think its implications might have on Black girls in the juvenile justice system. So when you think about a judge or any other legal professional who is looking at a Black girl and potentially seeing someone older or less innocent than a white girl of the same age, how can that show up? Harsher sentencing. Yep. Right, so that makes sense that when we're looking at someone that we view as an adult and not a child, we're thinking about culpability and punishment as opposed to peer pressure, vulnerabilities, compassion. Less understanding of victimization. That's an excellent one that I'm going to reach in a couple of slides, right? Right. Not seeing them as children. And that's key and why we named our report The Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood. Systemic trauma. Yep. So the system itself is layering on trauma by viewing Black girls as adults. That itself is a traumatizing experience. Absolutely. Right. And not extending that lens of compassion and trauma-informed support, but instead how to punish girls. Thank you for your participation in that. So I want to turn to Philip Goff's study. This was done in 2014. Oh, and I appreciate that, again, reminding us about joy and happiness of childhood that I see in the chat, or having dreams. Beautifully put. In 2014, Philip Goff studied Black boys, which I always point to as an example of how boys are usually centered in this kind of research, but it critically did establish a connection between adultification bias, which also happens for Black boys, and viewing them as more culpable for crimes. And his study in 2014 found that participants, which included trained police officers, overestimated Black boys' age by 4 years, but estimated white boys' age accurately. And they also critically perceived Black boys as more culpable for their action than their peers of other races. So when we turn to look at how adultification bias has unique implications for Black girls, of course, there's those similar implications that were just reflected in the chat, that adults are more likely to view Black girls as culpable and less likely to extend leniency or compassion that's usually extended to children. One of the unique effects for Black girls, though, has to do with that stereotype of the Jezebel that I discussed earlier, where adults view Black girls as hypersexualized. And if adults bring that perception into their decision-making capacity, they may unfairly punish Black girls who are actually victims, as was just put into the chat, of gender-based violence, as just one example. So when Black girls file a complaint about sexual violence, the response is more likely to be that they were complicit, that they are to blame, because that adult is viewing them more like an adult. Our work has engendered an amazing array of studies, and it is also making its way into the courts, which I wanted to bring all of your attention to for those of you who might be involved in litigation. The Washington State Court of Appeals in the last couple of years issued an advisory opinion recognizing the influence of adultification bias on the sentencing of Black girls, agreeing that it may affect children of color at criminal sentencing, and instructing trial courts to ensure that Black girls aren't sentenced more harshly than white girls. And it also came up in the Derek Chauvin trial, where the prosecution argued that Judge Cahill should rewrite his sentencing order, which had suggested that the Black girls who witnessed George Floyd's death and recorded it and testified at Derek Chauvin's trial weren't traumatized by what they saw. And in doing so, the prosecution was trying to recognize that adultification bias that treats Black girls who are actually victims of trauma as people who are not so affected. The judge declined the invitation to rewrite his sentencing order, but it's important to note that this issue is finding its way in the courts. So I just want to run this poll again, if I can find it. Hopefully it works. If you could pull out your phones again with this QR code. Apologies for flipping back and forth. But we wanted to ask, having learned what you have so far in the 35 minutes we've been together, do you believe that adultification bias causes harsher treatment of Black girls in the justice system? Okay. I'm going to turn it back to Thalia now so that we can engage in a discussion of all of these issues. Thalia, I'm going to put myself on mute, but I'll still be advancing the slides.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. So we really wanted to carve out this last sort of 25 minutes or so to be thinking about what's next. what can we do, right? So we can problematize, and all of that is great, but at what point do we start to think about solutions, right? To use Grace Lee Boggs' language, right, we have to be solutionary. So if we know things are happening and we know we want to see meaningful change so that we don't have the forgottenness, so we don't think about being misunderstood, and we can really embed a deeper sensibility of resilience and support our girls, then that becomes essential. So next slide, Rebecca. So a central question then becomes like, how do we take implicit bias out of not just the criminal legal system, the juvenile legal system, but all of the systems that are intersecting with how we think about what should be care, but becomes control over girls of color's bodies, them, their families, their caregivers, right? The whole host of them. And so that becomes, I think, a central place that we should all be operating from and asking that question. And so some of and I'll put sort of brackets around solutions, right? Some of the solutions that we're presenting here have been part of a series of focus groups and conversations and really listening and learning sessions from folks that are working as stakeholders in a whole host of areas in that way. Next slide. You know, and again, right, I think the emphasis with this point is to say it is not impossible, right, to address implicit bias, but it also means that it's work. So it's not just a function of if we sort of dream it will happen. I do not have the magic implicit bias wand from Harry Potter. If I did, I would be happy to pass it along to everybody and share it, but that's not something that we're sort of sitting in this time and space. So what then becomes the practical ways, and we're going to put a host of these out there and then really turn it over to conversation amongst everyone. What are some of the practical ways? Next slide. One is about training, right? The more you know, right? Sort of putting this out there. And it's not about training just for training's sake, but it's also training so that this becomes dismantling the normal environments, those hallway conversations, those conversations in front of a judge, the conversations with parents and caregivers, or even as this has been examined in the medical context, the conversation between an emergency room nurse and a young Black girl seeking care. So it's about creating, right, a foundation in which there becomes a shared lexicon that isn't about marginalization, that isn't about presuming that someone who is 11 is 15, isn't about blaming them or hypersexualizing them, right, when they're in that space of victimization. So training is not simply just to check a box, but to really change the norms and culture and context within whatever the space you're working in. Maybe that's an office, right? Maybe that's not, right? Maybe that's a community setting. Maybe that's interactions, right, with other system stakeholders. Next slide. The next is thinking about auditing and tracking progress. Because at the end of the day, right, without knowing what's happening, or more importantly, how things are happening, not just describing the effect, but the underlying, it's really hard to think about what the solutions would be. So while we have some data that we've shared at the beginning of this presentation, there still remains quite a bit of murkiness, right, grayness about how is this implicating the lives of girls of color, and in particular Black girls. And so there needs to be greater transparency, and that's where data collection becomes significant. You know, it's really challenging to imagine those hallway conversations, right, and sort of tracking those, but what is it to think about on specific forums, right? Where and how is there language being used? How in a courtroom setting, for example, is a child being referenced? Are they being referenced as a child? Are they being referenced as a young lady? Are they being referenced as a defendant, right? All of these different ways, a perpetrator, and how that matters. And that's particularly true when there's different patterns that exist around this intersectional bias of race and gender and age. And then, of course, where that becomes systemically evident, getting back to this point of systemic failure, starting to actually take actions according. Until it's out and transparent, it's much harder to engage in the systemic reforms. Next slide. But essential to this is also thinking about incorporating the input of young people, right? At the end of the day, young people are the experts of their experiences and lives. And so if we don't do this from a participatory standpoint, we, right, all have been young people before, we are not young people anymore. I'm sorry, I'm 46. I do not know what it's like to be a 9-year-old, right? I don't know what it's like to be a high schooler, thankfully. And so, right, how do we start to collect that information? And then also, how do we start to think about humanizing? And it's not just in the context of the individualized work that you are doing, but also in the context of the larger systemic change. What is the participatory dynamics in which that type of input can occur? Next slide. So ultimately, we think about accountability structures. So you, right, might have heard ways in which Black girls are being referenced, but you might not have heard every way. So when we incorporate input, when we're talking to young people about the ways in which they're experiencing all forms and pathways of system, it allows us to be able to create, right, those tracking mechanisms, do that auditing, and then have the accountability. And that's really particular in terms of the documents and procedures. Next slide. Certainly that then turns to how do we change culture and context, right? The norms in which we work become so significant. That means both elevating and thinking about how we call people in and make change. So we want to really be putting the ethics, the equity, the fairness on the, at play, but also elevating the practices and ways in which individuals are really dismantling and interrupting bias. And then lastly, next slide. This is not a path of one, right? This is a collaborative path. So how and where, as different stakeholders within the systems in which you're working, can you not just identify the patterns, but then think about periodic reviews, serving on, for example, if there became a larger review committee, which we've seen implemented in certain jurisdictions, to really start to imagine then what are we monitoring for, how are we adjusting, and what do the decision making become, so that it isn't a singular discretionary decision, or perhaps 2 or 3 people who hold that discretionary decision-making power, but a larger collective in that way. Next slide.
I think we're going to move to a poll. Do you want to do the poll, or should we do the...
Sure. No, that's fine.
Actually, let's see. Oh, no, we have this one. You're right, Thalia. You were right. Go ahead.
That's okay. No problem. So I want to bring us back to that call to the question when we entered into solutions, right? Like, how do we do this? I just quickly went through a handful of things, and I recognize I went with a bit of speed because I wanted to carve out these last 15 minutes for some of that discussion. How do we do this, right? Like, how do we think about what it is to overcome this, but more importantly, challenge it, invest in ways in which we're disrupting those pathways, and really at the end of the day, build the capacities, the resilience, the strength, and provide the full meaningful supports for girls of color. So this is where I recognize we have 31 people. It is always challenging to do this when we're in a Zoom context, but I really invite, whether it's in the chat or someone just pinging in and elevating themselves in terms of taking themselves off of a hidden screen and putting some other ideas on the table. Maybe you've seen things work, maybe you've seen things not work, but this is our time.
I'm walking in the house, but sorry, y'all.
Hey, Marcia.
It's so good to see you. I think for me, the more I do this work, the reason why I was intentional about mentioning joy is because I think that there are consistently just language, and even how we sometimes as practitioners or folks in the space talk about Black girls is often from a very detrimental place, as if they're like incapable, they are angry, they're traumatized, and the more I do this work, it kind of glazes over in like politicians, like folks place, and it's kind of like they are like, yes, exactly, that's exactly what we're talking about. And so, I've been trying my best in the last years of my work to be intentional about also talking about the joy that like brown and Black girls and boys have, because I think that that has been systematically and historically taken away from us in a really harmful way. Yes, and I think it's really important for people to use language or talk about healing, right? And say, like, there's an opportunity for us to heal and like work with them on their joy, like from the things that have happened. And now working in the trafficking space, right? Yes, there's so much trauma that they experience, but there is an opportunity for us to really help these young women, young people heal in a way that, you know, I think throughout history we just haven't allowed. And so that's something I think is important, to really challenge the language that we're using as a community about Black girls.
And I think that dovetails exactly with a discussion of childhood, because the most fundamental component of childhood is innocence, of joy, resilience, exuberance. So I agree with you that we need to come at this through a strengths-based perspective, not through deficit language. We've heard people say that they're stopping referring to Black girls in the courtroom as young ladies, which is something that some people, which is a term that people use that might be unintentionally harmful. It might be intended as a term of respect, but it actually takes away from the fact that this is a child who's entitled to innocence. Thalia, were you going to add anything to that?
Nope, just so we can capture things in different ways. I took liberty with what Marcia was saying and really centralized to this idea of shifting away from deficit-based language, right? And how and where are we elevating, not just how to view Black. Oh, I love when you move your hands too much and you start getting symbols on your Zoom. So I'm keeping my arms down. Not just how to view children, but the ways in which in viewing them, right? And the ways in which we think about youth, we think about that ability to live in a place of growth, and innocence and childhood, what that then is reflected in our actions, because there is a direct linkage between those. And I appreciate Marcia has added even more into the context as well in the chat. Others. Again, the chat is a great place, taking yourself off camera. We appreciate all of this.
One way that we can also engage in conversation is to reflect on some of the suggestions that Thalia went over in our slides about how do we collaborate with others? How do we gather input from young people? What are some accountability mechanisms that you all can think of that can help us overcome this form of implicit bias?
I know I'm going to keep talking, but I I will if no one does. I think redirecting the questions that we ask young people too, kind of similar to what I was saying, like asking young people like what they want, what they like, you know, what words would they use to describe themselves, right? Like even their circumstances that they're in. You know, understanding that there are strengths to being in survival mode that, again, I don't think we use the correct language for. And you know, I kind of steer away from resilient too, because that has become a bit of a damaging word. So I think being intentional about incorporating young people's voice, but again, not just us asking them for all their traumas, but like painting a full picture of them as children, I think is really important. Like I'll never forget, I wrote a piece about Ma'Khia Bryant when she passed away, and one of my friends pointed out that she had on rainbow Crocs. And I intentionally put that in my story because, right, like that's something she really liked. And they mentioned that she really loved Crocs and all these other things. So again, it made me think about, right, but the focus was such on her story and the fighting and being in foster care that no one intentionally acknowledged her own things as being a child in school or at a playground. So trying to incorporate that, I think, is important.
Which makes me think about, what is that relational and participatory voice? How is that done in a way that's not transactional, right? So much of system-based work has become very transactional in nature, as much as, that was not or should not, right, shall we say, be the purpose and intention. I saw also, here that we have a comment in the chat about collaborating with community organizations that are working in service so that it becomes meaningful in the actions that are taken, again, so that it's not just sort of generalized actions, presumptions about what is good, right, overlaying that sort of very paternalistic sensibility of what to be of service is, but having that be context. I think, again, this acknowledging humanness, right? The story of who you are when you show up in crisis is not the totality of the story of your life. And so how and where, right, do we ensure that that story is one that is imbued with your childhood, right? And is about scaffolding you against from moving deeper into a system that wants to break your childhood, diminish your childhood, and dispossess you of the opportunities of what it is to just simply be a young person because you live at that intersection of identity. And so having that sense of clarity about that. So we have about 8 minutes left. And so we want to turn back to the PowerPoint simply because there is an embedded sort of last exercise for all of us to be thinking about.
Yeah, before we do that, I just want to add to Aviva's point about community-based organizations. Another reason that's such an important point is that so many decision makers feel their hands are tied. They have no choices about how to support a young person in their courtroom, and they're not aware of the resources that exist in the community. So bringing community-based organizations to the table also serves a very practical point of helping educate judges and others about options other than involvement in the system. So we wanted to go back to this question to see if anything has changed for you since the beginning of this presentation about what words come to mind when you think of girls in the juvenile justice system. We'll have that same QR code if you could hold up your phones to that. And has anything changed? What words come to mind now when you think of girls in the juvenile justice system? And let me know if it's not working. Hopefully it is. Joy. I'd love to just frame that. Joy. Worthy. Great. This is amazing. And I know that word clouds can seem cheesy, and yet to me, it's so powerful to see a shift in lens that can happen from the deficits and the challenges that we rightly were thinking about at the beginning of this presentation, because those challenges are very real. And then changing the mindset to viewing Black girls as children with all of the beauty and the power that childhood encompasses. So thank you very much for your participation in that poll. And I think with that, we can wrap up. I don't know if our hosts have any closing words to share. If not, we can give you back 4 minutes of your time, but we want to thank you so much for attending this session and for the opportunity to share our work with everyone here.
Yes, thank you everybody for joining us. We do have a small, short survey if you don't mind completing that. I'll put that link in the chat. And then our next collaboration meeting is on September 9th at 9 a.m. Pacific time, 12 p.m. Eastern. And thank you again for joining us. We'll send out the material shortly. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.